Okay, and looks like it might be working. Yep, good to go.
All right. So I'm good to go. All right. Uh, so, okay. You see that? All right. So this is Wendt's social theory of international politics. So he begins with an overview of IR, and constructivism is a response to both realism and liberalism. Wendt argues that neither of these sufficiently explores the social theories found in other social sciences. Their debate, he claims, is whether states seek absolute or relative gains. At the end of the Cold War, he suggests that the materialistic and individualistic theories of realism and liberalism fail to accurately describe the fall of the Soviet Union. Instead, IR needs a social theory. There are four further sociologies of structure: materialist, idealist, individualist, and holist. These lie on two axes: material ideational, do ideas matter, and individualist holist, does the structure matter? Wendt places himself in the idealism holism quadrant. He accepts anarchy and argues that constructivism proposes new solutions to anarchy. Further, anarchy may have three kinds of structure: enemy, rival, and friend. People may not want to work together towards common ends, and society conditions people to act in certain ways. There are two problems of anarchy. Enemies are situated in an us versus them relationship where violence is potentially unlimited. This is Hobbesian anarchy, and according to Wendt, is the false belief of realists. The rivalry structure still involves us versus them, but expresses limited violence. For example, states recognize the sovereignty of others. Wendt suggests this is Lockean and thus liberalism. Lockean assumptions are better than Hobbesian, or Lockean assumptions are a better explanation, Wendt claims, but they fail to consider that states may become friends. This is the Kantian approach and is Wendt's basis for constructivism. It requires states to internalize a shared culture which ultimately brings peace. Context and larger debate. He opens his work by situating himself within a larger body of literature, which argues that international politics is a social construct, listing Grotius, Kant, Hegel, and Hedley Bull as examples. The constructivist school asserts two fundamental premises: one, that it is shared ideas, not material conditions, which drive human interaction; and two, the identity and interest of actors is constructed from these ideas and not nature. These tenets are at odds with, as Wendt notes at the outset of chapter 1, individualist and materialist social theory, against which he asserts structural idealism. Wendt, however, proposes a thinner form of constructivism in the book, which makes concessions to the materialist and individualist positions. His aim for this thin constructivism is to strike a third way, which can straddle the ground between IR scholars more devoted to constructivism than he and those who reject constructivism out of hand. So for this takeaways section, I'm just going to read what I think is important to know. Let's see. So he says realism cannot explain structural change, and that its theory of structure cannot produce non-falsifiable claims. He says liberalism is insufficient because it adds an institutional superstructure to realism's material base. So it's just a realism with icing on the realist cake, I guess. I don't know. He is friendliest to the English school because of the emphasis on ideals and ideas as a driver of international relations. Let's kind of skip over the questions. Okay, so what questions he's trying to answer is kind of what this is looking at. So he's trying to find a alternative explanation to the pessimism of international relations from the realist perspective. If he's correct, violence, war, and nationalism are unnecessary. Instead, we can devote resources towards social goods, preventing famine, increasing healthcare, and lowering taxes. However, if he's wrong, it risks weakening the nation and bringing about its decline. If Wendt is right that a Kantian culture of anarchy is possible, then war is not inevitable and perpetual peace can be brought about. Okay, so love some good memes here, but yeah, I mean, I think if I remember correctly, nobody in that class was super convinced I think that he is just. I think at one point one of us was like, we don't see people who operate on the basis of ideals alone
Hmm.
surviving in the international system. Like those states die out because they are outcompeted by states that operate on the like their security interests and their material interests. So I think just basically the thing to emphasize here is that constructivists argue that ideals and not interests are driving international relations, and that's just wrong.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think I wrote that last paragraph on there because that's my main criticism with
yeah,
constructivism.
yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
but it's also, I guess, it's important to think like the constructivists would say that if you start talking about things in terms of threat, then you build a what's the word that they used to call it? Like a realist. Um, uh, Man, essentially like a realist frame of mind is kind of how they describe it. So then you start when
Hmm.
you start talking about stuff in terms of power politics, then you start appearing to be a then you start leading towards war. Um, like everything
Yeah,
becomes a threat. So
yeah. And I think maybe the realists would respond like, that's inevitable. And if you don't adapt to that environment,
mhm.
like if you maintain your idealist ethos in your decision making, your state won't survive. And that's borne out by reality because
Yeah,
there's no state that exists. I mean, every state that's done this has not survived. It seems like I can't think of one that.
yeah, yeah. And like Mearsheimer says that in chapter one of Tragedy of
Mhm.
Great Power Politics. He's like, yeah, states
Yeah.
can pretend like realism isn't what it is, but those states don't survive.
Right.
So, um, yeah,
They're not good at being
what,
states.
yeah, which kind of gets at because like I do think Wendt's generally right where realism isn't great at describing like when like how do power structures how does the polarity shift like
Hmm.
realists aren't great at doing that. He's right about that, but
Right.
um,
Yeah.
you know, Mearsheimer would probably say that like states will, maintain this situation until they do something stupid. Um,
Mm. Hmm. Hmm.
so and that's what happens. So yeah,
Yeah. This kind of makes me think, like going back to what I was saying about Allison, about like low stakes versus high stakes. Like I think like there's more. Maybe this is kind of the English school streak in me coming out, but there's more space for ideals and values to operate when the
mhm.
stakes are lower. And then when it comes down to the wire, states have to adopt a more realist mindset if they want to survive.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think
So,
it's a surprise that all of this stuff was coming out in the '90s and
yeah, yeah,
2000s. Um,
yeah. When we had the luxury of doing so.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Hmm.
Well, cool.
All right, you ready to move on to Schelling?
Yeah.
All
Yeah. I looked through the
right.
Shelley and we kind of put it in an inconvenient way with
Yeah,
like the
well, it's not good. I have like the cleaned up physical copies, but I don't know. I couldn't find the because
mm,
we made the first one and Jordan was like, this is way too long,
yeah.
and then we cut it.
Yeah.
But jeez, I don't know. I'll
I mean, we can
I,
just talk about it too. Like, I don't think we need to go through it
yeah.
specifically if we. Um,
Well, I mean, I've got
all right.
the
Yeah,
chapter summaries are pretty short,
okay.
so
Yeah, let's just go through that.
yeah. All right, so Schelling, first chapter is the diplomacy of violence. So for the West, diplomacy and military strategy stand opposed, with diplomacy being a peaceful agreement of common interest. And while military strategy requires the taking of another's through violence, post Napoleon, however, military strategy became the ability to hurt or the threat to hurt the other.
Mm-hmm.
War is a bargaining process of pain acceptance. Nuclear weapons make this more apparent since both sides can now hurt the other quickly, regardless of their position in the field. Now, instead of being diametrically opposed, war is the diplomacy of violence. Um, Chapter 2, The Art of Commitment. Biggest challenge for states is demonstrating that they will go to war over peripheral interests. This is where the paradox of deterrence fits. There are several techniques to show your resolve. For example, maneuvering yourself into a position where you cannot choose another path or staking national honor on a position. To counter these, you can discredit an adversary using salami tactics, employ the game of chicken, or employ strategic ambiguity. Whichever tactic used requires us to decide between compellence and deterrence, or active versus passive strategy. Either way leads to brinkmanship, since the state that succeeds at that wins the game. Chapter 3, The Manipulation of Risk. Not every threat is believable because of uncertainty. Risks are taken to probe what can and cannot be done, which boundaries are hard and which are porous. Judgments about how actions will be perceived complicates diplomacy and risks accidents spilling over into major conflict. Risks are weighed in the balance of degrees. If one foresaw imminent nuclear war, one would turn away and find an alternative. Deterrence is projecting the certainty of a response to certain action. Successful manipulation of the degrees of risk at the brink requires uncertainty or the threat fails. Limited war is a strategic consideration, as it may become a crisis in which both sides eventually lose control over the sequence of events. Tactics in local wars thus lose much of their significance as strategic planners become more preoccupied with whether a conflict will escalate. The escalation of danger is the central feature of using nuclear weapons. Nuclear conflict becomes a test of nerve, hence the allusion to the game of chicken. However, both sides can coordinate an exit strategy or the avoidance of a nerve test altogether. All right, so then I'll switch over to the second document here. All right, so chapter 4, the possibility of surrender admits bargaining into warfare. Combatants can come to terms to prevent the unnecessary accumulation of higher risk from prolonged hostilities. For example, the U.S. wished to defeat but not destroy the Japanese government so an occupation could be completed before the Soviets asserted themselves in the region. Such an endeavor requires restraint. This contrasts with the Korean War, in which each side fought with restraint in order to avoid escalation. The risk of reciprocity disincentivizes implementing certain weapons, so obviously nuclear weapons, poison gas, etc., leading to a preference for unambiguous hard bans over bans by degrees, since bans by degrees eventually erode. Crossing hard bans or boundaries bears a symbolic significance, communicating that an inhibition has been shed. To be effective, boundaries must be simple, recognizable, and conspicuous. There are two responses to an enemy who crosses the boundary. The first is to invest more effort to offset the loss incurred, and the second is reprisal. Nuclear weapons intensify this dynamic. The escalation of conflict is intrinsic to the use of nuclear weapons due to the beliefs and expectations associated with them. Their use, therefore, is an ultimate threshold, which sweeps away all boundaries and opens the door to all implements of war being fair game. Chapter 5. Counterforce warfare is fought in two stages. First, the two sides attempt to disarm the other. Second, there is bargaining over cities as targets, as the side with the most residual weapons retains or maintains greater leverage. However, without an agreement of terms, both sides retain weapons, necessitating that the combatants come to terms. Ideally, this can be done before hostilities begin. Nuclear capability accelerates the time frame in which this may occur before cities are targeted. In the absence of this, an armistice is possible, even if there is only a tenuous ceasefire. The stronger combatant in counterforce warfare can choose whether to leave intact or destroy the opposing regime. Depending on their war doctrine, this may enfeeble enemy militaries or make them unpredictable. Schelling describes the bargaining process of warfare as having 6 concerns. First is determining the war's conduct. Second is the process of coming to terms. Third is the choice of whom to negotiate with on the part of the defeated enemy. Fourth is the resolution as it pertains to the battlefield. Fifth is long-term disarmament and assurances thereof. And sixth is the political allegiances and geographic integrity of territories and nations. All right. Chapter 6, Railroads and Reserves were the two great pieces of machinery that changed warfare in World War I. Now mobilization looked like a potential invasion, and mobilization could not be easily slowed or stopped. As the premium on haste grew, so did the chance for an inadvertent war as it becomes necessary to act quickly. One of the largest determinants of whether a given weapon system relies on the premium of haste is whether it is strong or stable. Strong weapon systems encourage haste, while stable systems encourage patience. The keys to deterrence in a nuclear world, though, are weapons that are not vulnerable to a first strike, but are also not easily used for a first strike. In other words, disarming makes us less safe, not more, since we become more vulnerable to first strikes. The only way in which disarmament is peaceful comes from an unfeasible world state. Instead, a more stable system is one with equal readiness on both sides. And finally, Chapter 7, communication between parties helps improve arms control, but it is not summits or formal agreements that assist with this, but rather day-to-day verbal communication and nonverbal actions. These are harder to discern and include budgets, force postures, and spending priorities. There is still an allowance for verbal communication, however, but this is risky. To prevent that risk, whatever the means or ends of communication, it must be done with, quote, eyes open and no commitment, close quotes. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's really it.
Yeah.
I think the takeaways are that, like, nuclear weapons basically make warfare all about bargaining, and let me try to find it. The tactics of, oh shoot, I think it's on my paper copy, but like the whole salami tactics, the game of chicken, and what's the other one?
Brinkmanship.
Strategic ambiguity.
Oh yeah, strategic ambiguity.
Yeah. But I guess if you were to like define brinkmanship in a sentence, like what would that be? Just like
I think the best way to define it is actually, I think, Schelling's example of you're grappling with your opponent on the edge of a cliff, or you're tied to your opponent on the edge of a cliff. And brinkmanship is getting close enough to the cliff where it looks like you'll both fall. So they have to give you concessions.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's about, like, what brinkmanship is intentionally wrapping up the tensions in order to force your opponent to be the first to back down. And I think, some key parts with Schelling, what he's getting at is that nuclear war, at least like nuclear posturing now, is trying to give your opponent the initiative, which is different from all war that preceded it. So you want your opponent to be the one to have to decide whether or not to use nuclear weapons, because your opponent will almost never choose to use nuclear weapons. So if you can force him to be the one to back down, then you've got. If you can be the one to force him to have to decide whether or not to use nuclear weapons, then you win, because they will back down and concede.
Right. So it's a contest to maneuver, like with the grappling analogy, to maneuver your opponent in such a way that you force him to lose his nerve, but you do that by giving him the initiative to make him appear the aggressor, and to give you the sort of moral capital of seeming to be the affronted party. So like optics is a big concern.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't even say it's like a moral thing as much as, like, for the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy put up the blockade, which meant the only way for Khrushchev to win was to be the one to try to run the blockade and, like, destroy the ship.
Yeah. I guess, like, what I mean by that is, like, moral high ground, in as much as, like, you intentionally manipulate the situation to make the other person have to be the aggressor.
Yeah. I don't think Schelling's saying it's a moral thing, though.
Right. Yeah.
he's saying it's like a decision thing. Like the other side
Hmm.
has to be the one to do, like
Yeah,
has to
yeah,
be the one who has to make the
that's what I'm
decision.
doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, and so it's yeah, I think that's Schelling's big contribution. And Schelling was like the only one who talked about
Hmm.
nuclear war seriously at that time. I remember Jordan bringing that up.
Hmm.
Was that Schelling was the one who's like, we need to seriously examine it. And there's a few techniques that I think he gets into to like make it um, like you want to have something like a dead man switch, right? So
Hmm.
that um, yeah, so that any nuclear attack against you will be returned, and you don't get to choose whether or not it is returned. Because the whole thing is like you need to be able to call bluffs. The and then like another one is like give battlefield commanders nuclear weapons. So then um, you offload like the ability for you to control nuclear weapons and give it to people who would be more willing to use it in the case of a conventional attack. So that's like another
Hmm.
technique you can use. Um, or um, let's see what are some of the other strategies. Yeah, I think those are like some of the main ones. I think he goes through a few
Hmm.
more, but I forget what they are. Um,
That's what didn't Eisenhower want that? Like he wanted field commanders to have access to nuclear weapons or
maybe.
to have yeah, I think it was Eisenhower.
Yeah. Well, I
Um
know MacArthur really wanted it during Korea,
yeah, yeah.
but yeah, and so like Schelling would point to something like the um, SDI, Reagan's SDI, as being very very bad, um, because if you start making it seem like you can win a nuclear war,
Hmm.
then the whole like um, you know the whole sort of thing just breaks down, and it
Hmm.
becomes much much more dangerous.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because like to put it in like Sun Tzuian terms, Star Wars puts the Russians on death ground, sort of like it nullifies the advantages, so there's no disincentive to not
Right.
actually launch nuclear weapons. Okay.
Right. And it becomes like a um, like Star Wars doesn't just appear like that.
Sure.
SDI doesn't just appear like that. So as you're trying to build it, it becomes like if you're the Soviets and you're worried about this, wouldn't you just do a preemptive
Preempt.
strike
Yeah.
while you still
Yeah.
can?
Yeah.
So it's like
Hmm.
unnecessarily raising tensions for no strategic gain.
Hmm. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So really, the key things are like brinkmanship and then bargaining, the different ways of bargaining, so salami tactics and all that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, and that war is now about causing pain, not about
Yeah.
defeating.
Bypassing armies.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That
Um,
ability to
yeah.
inflict hurt.
Yeah. I guess the only author that I can think that we haven't covered at all is Aron. Uh,
Yeah.
but I
I think
mean,
we might
whatever.
just play a luck of the dice and
Yeah, I
assume there's
mean,
not going to be two questions about him specifically.
yeah, I think we'll be okay. I mean, I know he's a classical realist. I'm not really sure what like differentiates him from the others. I didn't take that class, but I think it'll be fine.
Yeah. And then Thucydides we didn't really talk about. Well, I guess we talked a little bit about him.
We talked a little bit, but that one is just like I think that they'll look for broad strokes, and it's really just about Sparta fighting a preventative war or whatever.
Yeah. Thucydides trap or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
All right, cool.